So let me tell you about a bank account in Qatar. Not a bank account in New York, not a bank account in Washington, a bank account in Qatar. And in that bank account sits $200 million, American tax dollars? No. Venezuelan oil money. Money from oil that was seized by the United States military. Oil that was sold on the global market. Oil that generated $500 million in the first sale alone. And nobody in Congress knew where the money was until Wednesday. On January 28th, 2026, Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was there to talk about Venezuela's transition to democracy. But what he ended up talking about was money, lots of money, billions of dollars in seized oil, and a bank account in the Middle East that is raising every possible red flag. Here's what we know. The United States military seized Venezuelan oil assets earlier this year, about 50 million barrels of crude. At current market prices, that's roughly $2 billion worth of oil. The administration started selling that oil. The first sale brought in $500 million. Senators wanted to know where that money went. That's a reasonable question. We're talking about $500 million from the sale of assets seized by American forces. Where's the money? Rubio told them. $300 million went to Venezuelan banks to pay for basic services, healthcare, police, government operations. But the other $200 million, so that's sitting in a bank account in Qatar. Let me say that again. $200 million from the sale of Venezuelan oil seized by American troops is sitting in a bank account in Qatar, not in the U.S. Treasury, not in the Federal Reserve, Qatar. And that's just the first sale. There's potentially another $1.5 billion coming down the pipeline. Same oil, same seizure, same question about where the money goes. This is the story of the Venezuela billions, how they got seized, how they got sold, and why they ended up in a bank account in the Gulf. Let me take you inside that hearing, because the moment Rubio revealed the Qatar account, the room changed. You could feel it. Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut asked the obvious question, why Qatar? Why not New York? Why not a bank under American jurisdiction where Congress can see the transactions? Rubio's answer was careful. He said the account belongs to Venezuela. He said the U.S. doesn't control the account itself. He said we only control when money gets released and who gets it. We're gatekeepers, not owners. But here's the problem with that answer. If the U.S. military seized the oil and the U.S. government arranged the sale and the U.S. administration decides when money gets dispersed, how exactly do we not control that account? It's like saying you don't own the car, you just hold the keys and decide who can drive it and where it can go. That's ownership by any reasonable definition. Senator Murphy pushed harder. He said, essentially, we took oil at gunpoint, sold it, and parked the cash in the Gulf. What kind of precedent does that set? Are we now the world's repo man? The most aggressive response came from the House side. Representative Lloyd Doggett from Texas didn't wait for the hearing to end. He immediately fired off a letter. He sent it to both Rubio and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and he did not mince words. Doggett called it what it is, an offshore account. He demanded to know what legal authority the administration is using to act as custodian of these funds. And he asked the question that cuts to the heart of this. Why didn't the administration choose a country with stronger banking laws and better transparency? That's the real question. Why Qatar? To understand the answer, you have to understand Venezuela's debt problem. And it's a massive problem. Venezuela owes approximately $170 billion to international creditors. That includes Wall Street bondholders. That includes oil companies like ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil, who had their Venezuelan assets seized years ago. That includes other countries that lent Venezuela money. All of these creditors want their money back, and they have lawyers, very good lawyers. If the administration had deposited that $200 million in a bank in New York, those creditors would have been in court immediately. They would file motions to garnish the funds. They would argue that Venezuela owes them money, and this is Venezuelan money, so they should get paid. A judge would likely freeze the account within days. The money would be tied up in litigation for years. The interim Venezuelan government that the U.S. is trying to support would never see a dime. So Rubio's logic goes like this. Qatar is neutral territory. It's outside U.S. jurisdiction. American courts can't touch it. The money stays liquid. It can actually be used for its intended purpose. There's precedent for this kind of thing. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the U.S. set up something called the Development Fund for Iraq. That fund was held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, but that setup had a specific United Nations mandate that granted it immunity from legal claims. Here's the difference. There is no UN mandate for the Venezuela Fund. The U.S. is acting unilaterally. No international body blessed this arrangement. We just did it. Sources close to the administration, cited in reports from outlets like Semaphore and The Independent, claim Qatar was chosen because it allows the money to move freely and safely. But that safety is exactly what worries oversight groups. If the money is in the U.S. Treasury, the Inspector General can audit it. If it's in the Federal Reserve, there's a paper trail that Congress can examine. If it's in a commercial bank in Doha, who's watching? Who's verifying the transactions? Who's making sure the money goes where it's supposed to go? Senator Elizabeth Warren has been particularly vocal about this risk. She put it bluntly. There is no basis in law for a president to set up an offshore account that he controls to sell assets seized by the American military. Warren is now probing major U.S. banks. She's asking J.P. Morgan and Citibank whether they were approached to handle these funds. And if they were approached, why did they say no? Because if American banks refused to touch this money because the legal risk was too high, that makes the move to Qatar look even more suspicious. Let's zoom out and look at the scale of what we're talking about. The hearing focused on the $200 million currently sitting in Qatar, but that's just the beginning. The U.S. controls 50 million barrels of Venezuelan crude. The $500 million sale was just the first batch. That means there's potentially another $1.5 billion to $2 billion in revenue coming. And if this Qatari account is the pilot program, it stands to reason all that money will flow through the same channel. We're looking at a multi-billion-dollar shadow budget. It's controlled by the State Department and the White House. The only check on that power is this vague blocking mechanism that Rubio described. No congressional appropriation, no traditional oversight, just executive discretion. Representative Doggett's letter raises a darker possibility: corruption. Venezuela's history is plagued by the looting of state assets. The oligarchs who ran things under Chavez and Maduro became billionaires by siphoning government money. They awarded themselves contracts. They moved money offshore. They built empires while their country collapsed. So Democrats are asking a simple question: what safeguards are in place to ensure the new interim government doesn't do the same thing? Rubio testified that the U.S. audits the spending. He said the interim leaders submit a budget every month. He said we review it, we approve it, we monitor it. But without an independent auditor on the ground in Qatar or Caracas, we're taking the administration's word for it. And in Washington, taking someone's word for it when billions of dollars are involved is not considered best practice. There's also a political angle that can't be ignored. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has tried to stay above the fray. He said, we're the bankers here. We don't direct the funds. He wants to frame this as a technical banking matter, not a political decision. But Senator Adam Schiff isn't buying it. He sent his own letter demanding to know if any senior administration officials have financial stakes in the companies handling these oil sales. Are people profiting from this arrangement? Because if they are, we've moved from questionable policy into potential corruption. Now let's talk about the legal question. Is this even legal? The administration is almost certainly relying on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This law gives the president broad powers to regulate commerce after declaring a national emergency. Trump declared a national emergency regarding Venezuela years ago. That declaration is still in effect. But here's the thing. Regulating commerce and seizing foreign sovereign assets, selling them, and banking the cash in a third country are very different things. Normally, when the U.S. seizes foreign assets, they get frozen. Frozen means they sit there untouched until there's a political resolution. But the administration isn't freezing this oil. They're actively selling it. They're converting it to cash. They're spending that cash. That's a proactive intervention. That normally requires congressional appropriation. Congress controls the power of the purse. By using the Qatari account, the administration bypasses that entire process. They've created a self-funding foreign policy operation. Congress never touches it. If this becomes the model, Congress loses its check on executive foreign policy. That's a massive shift in the balance of power. And there's another legal problem. The custodian argument Rubio is making is shaky. If the U.S. decides when to release the money and who gets it, then for practical purposes, the U.S. is the owner. Courts care about who has control. This means the U.S. government could be vulnerable to lawsuits from Venezuela's creditors. If a judge rules that the U.S. effectively owns this oil revenue, then the U.S. taxpayer could become liable for Venezuela's debts. We could end up on the hook for $170 billion. That's a nightmare scenario. While Washington argues about bank accounts and legal authority. There's a real situation on the ground in Venezuela. The interim government is desperate for cash. The Venezuelan economy is in ruins. The oil infrastructure is falling apart. Rubio argued that this money is vital for humanitarian purposes, healthcare, security, basic government operations. He told senators they're not going to fix Venezuela in 3 weeks, and he's probably right. Without cash, any transition fails. That $200 million in Qatar is a lifeline. If Democrats freeze that account or force it back into U.S. jurisdiction where creditors can grab it, the funding dries up. The interim government collapses. So Democrats are in a tough spot. They want oversight, but they don't want to accidentally destroy the Venezuelan transition by starving it of resources. So what happens next? There are 3 things to watch. First, the banks. Senator Warren gave major U.S. banks until today, January 29th, to respond to her inquiries. If J.P. Morgan or Citi or Bank of America confirms they refuse to touch this money, the scandal grows. It becomes a story about how the risk was so high that American banks said no. Second, the House Oversight Committee. Representative Doggett is not going to let this go. We're likely to see subpoenas for Treasury officials who set up the Qatari account. We're going to get testimony. We're going to get documents. This investigation is just getting started. Third, the money itself. Will that $200 million stay in Doha, or will political pressure force the administration to move it? And if they move it to the U.S., will the creditors immediately pounce and tie it up in court? Secretary Rubio thought he was explaining the administration's clever solution to a complex problem. What he actually did was expose an arrangement that looks questionable at best and potentially illegal at worst. The secret bank account is no longer secret. The questions are now public. And the battle for the Venezuela billions has only just begun. Here's what makes this particularly unusual: the precedent it sets. If this works, what stops them from doing it again? The U.S. has frozen assets belonging to Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Billions of dollars sitting in accounts, immobilized by sanctions. If the Venezuela model becomes standard practice, all of those frozen assets become potential funding sources for executive branch foreign policy. No need to go to Congress for funding. Just seize foreign assets, sell them, park the money offshore, spend it however you want. It completely cuts Congress out of the loop. That's why this matters beyond Venezuela. This is about who decides how American power gets used and who pays for it. The Constitution is clear. Congress has the power of the purse. The executive branch can't just spend money without authorization. But if you can fund operations by selling seized assets and parking the proceeds in Qatar, you found a loophole. There's also the international dimension. How do other countries view this? When the United States seizes Venezuelan oil, sells it, and deposits the money in a third country, what message does that send? To allies, it might look like aggressive overreach. To adversaries, it might look like piracy. To neutral countries, it might look like the U.S. doesn't care about international law. China and Russia are watching carefully. They're already trying to reduce dependence on the U.S. dollar. This gives them ammunition. They can say, see, the Americans will seize your assets and use them however they want. Senator Warren's investigation into whether U.S. banks refused this money is particularly important. If major American financial institutions said no thanks, that tells you something about the legal risk. Banks have compliance departments and lawyers who analyze whether transactions comply with U.S. law. If those lawyers said this is too risky, that's a red flag. The humanitarian argument Rubio made is real. Venezuela needs help. People are suffering. The interim government needs money to operate. But the ends don't always justify the means. There are legal ways to fund humanitarian assistance. Congress can appropriate money. International organizations can coordinate aid. Using seized assets and offshore accounts might seem elegant, but if it's illegal or even legally dubious, it's not a solution. It's a problem waiting to explode. This story isn't over. The legal challenges, the congressional investigations, the questions about oversight and accountability, they're all coming. We're going to hear more from Senator Warren about what the banks told her. We're going to see Representative Doggett's Oversight Committee dig deeper. We're going to watch as more Venezuelan oil gets sold and more billions flow into accounts we can't see and can't audit. What do you think? Is parking $200 million in a Qatari bank account a smart way to protect Venezuelan transition funds from creditors? Or is it a dangerous loophole that bypasses congressional oversight? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And subscribe for updates as this story develops. Because when billions of dollars are involved and nobody's quite sure if it's legal, you can bet there's more to come.